Can you talk a little bit about the printing process?
The printing process, these, I would love to be able to print these in a darkroom. I would love that. That's how I was trained. I love the smell of it. I love the magic of watching it emerge. It's so hard to do that now. So few of the materials are even manufactured anymore that you have to make your own. It's just not practical anymore. Photographs now are printed digitally, and these are printed with ink on paper. So in essence, they're a photographic print, but they're not a true photograph. We rarely look at true photographs made of light-sensitive emulsion on a paper. It's all pixels now. But I did want these to look as much unlike anything digitally created as possible, both in the aesthetic and in the way they were printed. So finding the right surface to print these on took forever. And the surface is incredibly important because I don't, like I said, I don't want them to look like digital prints. With the exception of the trees, everything in this room is printed on a paper called Hahnemuhle Rag Pearl. And Steve and I are very fortunate enough to have a small Agé, which is one of the photographers that I'm very influenced by. And I was always trying to find the surface of the paper that matched that. And I went through paper after paper after paper. And finally, when I found a sample of this rag pearl, I printed something on it, and I sat with the two photographs and held them and looked at them and looked at the sheen, and I'm like, okay, that works. But with these, I was really directly referencing Fox Talbot because some of the very earliest photographs, in fact, one of the two inventors of photography, Fox Talbot, his earliest images were of bare trees in the English countryside around his home. And so I was referencing those, and those had a very ephemeral, thin quality. And so this was a paper that I found that is specifically manufactured for reproducing Chinese ink paintings of egrets and things like that. And it's a beautiful, very delicate paper, and I love the way it curls. And you know, it's a framer's nightmare because things aren't supposed to curl, but I love that. I mean, and I was kind of having this problem when I was first seeing them in a frame. It's like, oh, they're curling. Oh, I like that. Oh, you know, going back and forth on them. The surface and stuff is very important in those. I have a printer. I do not print these large ones. I have a 24-inch printer in my studio, and all of the images, with the exception of the trees, are printed on that 24-inch printer, Epson.
And what about the paintings? Because I've never seen you do those kinds of.
Well, you know, originally those were printed the way I was talking about. The first clouds were printed, and they were face-mounted to plexiglass. So the mounting material, you were actually looking through to see the image, and that's what gave them that very glossy, almost TV screen quality. We actually found this printer that was able to do these when I was given the Omni commission, and we were trying to figure out how to print a big enough photograph out of a sturdy enough material that wouldn't fade. And I was coming up through all different ways of doing that, and then Talley and I actually were talking about a company, Teasley and Company, and they print outdoor banners, and that ink is lacquer, and so the light rating of, I mean, it's so supremely archival, it's not even funny, because they print the underwear models that hang on the side of buildings in New York and stuff like, and you know, those things hang out there and don't fade for months. So these are printed on the same machine that prints the underwear models. It prints on canvas. It's lacquer. It's like a, looks just like a gigantic inkjet printer, but the smell that comes out of it is absolutely so noxious that I'm amazed there's anybody living there. And they don't even smell it. You know, you walk in to see the pieces and they're like, they look great. But I love the surface of this because they are referencing actual paintings more than the earlier pieces. The earlier clouds, I did love that sheen. But I do love the fact that these are, for all practical purposes, these are paintings. On canvas, stretched. It's a really fun way of working. And this machine can print at such a ridiculously high resolution that you can get up close to those and you never see those images breaking down. And that's why I never previously printed on canvas, is those images always break down when you get within normal viewing distance of them, and these don't.
That image there looks like either a tintype or it looks like it's been solarized a little bit.
It didn't work as a positive. When I finished making the trees, it just didn't look right to me. And so I totally inverted it, knowing that a lot of the early Fox Talbots I were looking at were paper negatives. His early process, he exposed a piece of paper, so you had a negative, and then he waxed the piece of paper and then laid it in contact with another sheet of paper and printed the positive. But I had looked at a lot of the negatives, and I actually liked that. And in fact, in large photography collections, you'll see the negatives displayed sometimes when no positive exists. So that does look a little similar to a solarized image, but it was more me just sort of playing and saying, oh, it doesn't work as a positive. Let's see what happens if I invert it. So. Yes, ma'am.
Do you ever, like, since the paper with the surface also affects the image, do you ever look at the same image on different types of papers to see which one you like the best?
All the time. All the time. In my studio, when I'm working on stuff like this, are stacks of the same image printed on different papers and sometimes adjusted absolutely minutely, like printing. Once I find the right paper, I might say this one's too bright, this one's too dull, and I might go back and forth. There's a ship that actually is not hanging in this show, but that was done for that show, that there were about 20 different prints of it. And I would like it when I printed it, and then I'd come back and say, I don't like it. And, finally going back and forth. I actually ended up going back to the very first one I printed. So it was an extended moment of weakness.
All of these, you said some of these are real photographs and some of them are drawings. Do you layer these in Photoshop? Is that
Tons of layers, tons of layers. Now, all of these have the trees have real photographic elements in them, but bits and pieces only. So literally just stitched together.
You must have thousands of layers in some of these things.
You can't have thousands of layers because it kills the computer. It gets to the point that the computer's just like, girl. It just stops and shuts down and you'll lose the piece. So when I get sections built, I'll flatten those layers to kind of bring down the size of the file. And sometimes then I've decided I've done something wrong and you can't go back at that point. But I don't attach preciousness to any individual image. I've learned not to do that because you lose so many in the process and so many come out looking fairly fake. They actually look a lot more fake before you get the patina over them. The patina gives the look of an early photograph, but it also actually hides some of the things that I couldn't get quite the way I wanted them to look.
Do you create the patina yourself, or do you pull them from other images?
I pull the colors from early photographs. I literally have a palette there. The eyedropper tool in Photoshop is great just to go on and say, I like that, and I like that, and I like that, and I like that. A lot of the patinas are created with coffee on paper that are then scanned and played. And then sometimes I'm just playing around. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes I've just scanned blank sheets of paper and then just played. I've scanned a blank sheet of paper and then just done auto contrast on it. So it's trying to bring detail out of a blank sheet of paper, so all sorts of texture comes out in it. And then I'll start using those to layer on. Again, it's really Machiavellian. It's how you feel about working. The coffee is fun. In fact, that's become one of my main art making materials in the class when I teach with the kids, and they're always taking my coffee, and they're always taking the coffee of the people I teach with. And so you can smell coffee constantly in my room. It smells like a Starbucks.
I mean this as a compliment, but I consider you like a magician, kind of, because, these pieces arouse your curiosity because you don't know how they're made, and right now you're explaining how they're made. But I was wondering if, being so intimate in the process of the creation, if you feel that kind of, for me it's more mystifying when you don't know how it's made, right? Because there's so much ambiguity. But do you wish you could forget how you made it or something?
Yeah, only time makes you forget how you make them. And then you do get to the point, especially when you're my age, you do get to the point that you're like, I don't know how I did that, looking back at some things. There's something in there, the lily pads in that one. I've forgotten how I did that, but it worked. I think I was just making ovals and cutting little sections out of them and pasting them on and then blurring the edges. It's sort of like as you learn to paint. As you learn to work with a brush, sometimes you want to overwork something and then you find out that there is a much simpler way of doing it. You watch especially watching somebody like Michael Toll paint, and you think he goes through 1,000 different things to make this effect or this muscle tone, and then you watch him and he's like, well, no, I just did this. That's how you work in Photoshop. And that's how I work. I used to be really wary, as a lot of artists were, about giving away how I made them. Now I make these sometimes in front of my students. I let them look. I don't worry about it because you can show somebody exactly how you do something. They're never going to make the same thing you make. They're going to bring their own experience and aesthetic to it, and it's going to look absolutely totally different. So I used to be really weary about when people say, well, how are these made? Can I come in and watch? I'm like, my studio looks like a tax office. It looks nothing like an artist's studio. It's like this screen and then a bunch of stacks of paper around it. So people want to come in and watch me work, and it's like, it would really disappoint you. It would really, really disappoint you because I'm just sitting, moving with a mouse. And like say, if you like watching CPAs prepare tax forms, then come and watch me work.
Do you use the darkness of the pictures, like, other than that orangish tree, all of them are pretty dark? Do you use that to kind of like blend the layering a little bit?
No, a lot of early photographs that were influenced by, the base of the paper and the emulsion all had a tone to them. So the images have a darkness to them in general. And when I was trying to do these pieces, I was trying to replicate that and not trying to make something that was so bright that it appeared faker. Darkening these makes them look more photographic and actually adds a little more of an element of realism to them. These especially, all these works are based on a method of printing in the 1800s that was called albumen printing, wet plate collodion and albumen printing. And the surface of the paper always had that sort of taupish cream color to them. But a lot of early photographic methods yielded wildly different colors. Cyanotypes gave you a blue on white image, a very vivid, beautiful blue on white. And the gum bichromate process, where you use watercolor and you make the watercolor light sensitive, would yield you something that looked very much like this image. So when I'm choosing the palettes for the colors, they are based on what would have been plausible during the period of time I'm sort of emulating. What would have been plausible and what wouldn't have been plausible. The size of these would not have been plausible in the 1800s because enlarging a photographic negative did not happen until the very late 1800s, early 1900s. So the size of the negative was the size of the print. And sort of when you look at the early Western exploratory photographers like William Henry Jackson, and you see those beautiful mammoth photographs, those are made on glass. The negatives are glass that he coated on site and put in a giant camera and exposed and developed on site. And actually, he would pack all these things on a donkey and go out into the desert to take these images. And then the donkey occasionally fell off the cliff, and all of his negatives were gone, and you have to turn and go back and do it all over again. So you would never have an image this big back then. But I'm not trying to pass these off as fakes. I'm not trying to pass these off as an actual document. I'm trying to take the aesthetic and play with it. So playing with the size of that was sort of like, why not?
How do you settle on an image too? That's also like the process of selection. The clouds and trees that register something familiar. I'm guessing that's part of it, but I don't know how you answer that question.
Well, It is a neat question because when you do these, sometimes you don't really know what you're doing. I've never trusted an artist that tells me that they plan everything out in advance and this means this and this means this and the ship symbolizes this and this line. I've never trusted that. I think they're BSing on one form or another because every artist that I've ever watched work, you kind of zone out at a certain point and you don't know why you're creating or what you're creating, and a lot of these that are created do not look real to me. And so the ones that I know I'll never save, I don't even keep around, or that I know I can't save aesthetically and ever make a finished piece out of them. I'll just delete them and get rid of them. And I used to save all the ones that wouldn't work. And after a couple of beers, I'd go sit down and say, I can make that work. And it would just frustrate me because it would never work. And so I trust my intuition more and just kind of let them go. And then for the example, the ship that's sinking behind you, that sort of, I think that's called a frigate. There were about 10 different versions of that, and the ship was this far out. The ship was almost totally sunk. The ship was covered in smoke at one time. And it comes back to the aesthetic and the mood. I think I talked to you about this years ago, but when I listen to music, I never listen to lyrics, ever. I mean, there are things I've listened to for 35, 40 years now that I still don't know what they're singing about. I just love the music. And with these, it's sort of the same way. It's sort of like, I'll know it when it's done. It's the mood and not me sitting there saying, I want a picture of a ship going down. It's sort of like, I want a mood. And this is just fitting it. And the shipwrecks me the most symbolic thing I've ever done, because I do, the thing of a ship being on the ocean, I love the fact that you can get to the point that nature can still overpower us, despite every attempt that we've made to subjugate it and to compartmentalize it and to have control over it. There's still this moment that, nature can bitch slap you. And sorry, I should have used another, should have used a more delicate term. Nature can be in control. We've seen it with Katrina. We've seen it with everything else where all of a sudden everything we've tried to do, we're still at its mercy. And I like that. And these are sort of me thinking about that. But I think that's the most narrative I've ever gotten in a piece. That's the long answer.
Ted, I'm just curious if you've thought about how you see your work fitting into current sort of art historical, or even if you think about it at all.
I used to think about that a lot. I think when you're a younger artist, you do want to fit in. You do want to know how you're going to fit in. But I think that obviously is a detriment to your work sometime. The work becomes about fashion and not about, anything remotely original. If you're looking at what everybody's doing and trying to fit into that, or even trying to consciously go against it, you get to a point that you're not reacting honestly when you're creating work. So I don't know how these would fit in at all, and I like that. I mean, much like I think
They do think about it, but I just wondered if you had put any thought into it in terms of postmodernism, or sort of, because you are working in that area that's
It's definitely, this body of work definitely couldn't have happened without postmodernism. But, we integrate these things, and then all of a sudden they stop becoming a movement and they just start becoming a language or a tool like any other aesthetic or conceptual element. I don't know. I mean, watching the art world, and we go minimalism, and then we go conceptual, and then now we're maximalism, and now we're naive, and now we're not naive, and now we're cold, and now we're very warm. I mean, it goes in cycles. And I got to the point that, I wanted to make work that I loved looking at, that I really loved looking at. And not that I hadn't before, but I was more influenced by the critical discourse or whatever you wanted to say. And I got to the point that I was like, I just kind of want to make work for me. And I think when you do that, I think when you turn your back on the art world, I think when you just make that work, I think you make your strongest work. It may not be the most well-received work, but it's going to be the most honest.
Where do you see your next evolutionary step, or have you been thinking about that?
There's a whole body of work that actually have human figures pulling away from the ships right now in lifeboats, and the lifeboats are stacked with globes and boxes and books, and they're not there yet. They're going to get there, and I'm playing with that more. I'm also playing with fallow fields right now. I am been entranced with agricultural fields in the winter, and almost how they become almost like oceans. And I've been playing around with that right now and trying to figure out, will they be fake? Will they be real? Would this be a good time to pull straight photography back in? Because me displaying a straight photograph, somebody's going to question it now anyway, and I kind of like that. This must be fake. No, this is real. So those two bodies of work I'm working on right now. It's you get to the point that you're thinking 5 and 8 years down the line, and I never thought that would happen with my artwork, but you get to the point that like, okay, for the next 2 years I'm going to work on this because this is probably all I'm going to ever be able to get done in that 2-year period. But then I want to do this, and that's going to come after, and you keep yourself occupied. Well, thank you very, very much for sitting and listening to me ramble. I hope it made it clearer.